couple of weeks ago on this channel, I made a video with TK Doro, who's one of the maintainers of React Query, where we essentially talked about the future of React Query. So how is React Query going to look like in a world where we now write React on the server as well as on the client? Now, unfortunately, a lot of you guys have not seen that video, which is really a shame because it truly is a great video and it's really insightful. So if you haven't watched it, I'll leave a link in the description. I highly recommend it. So because of that, today I wanted to make a dedicated video looking at React Query and server components and how to combine both. And even you're going to see if you should combine both, because React Query should not necessarily always be used with server components. This is going to be a really interesting video. All right, cool. So let's begin. So over here, I have the official documentation from React Query, and I'm on specifically the advanced server rendering page. This, by the way, is a really great read. If you're trying to implement React Query and you're also working with server components, this is the documentation that you have to read. We are going to be basing our code in this video on this documentation, and it's also the same page that we looked at in the video that I did with TK Doro. So over here, I have my editor open and I'm running a Next.js application, which gives us access to server components enabled by default. I'm going to now show you how the implementation of React Query looks like on the server and the things that you need to think about when doing it this way. So we're going to come here, we're going to open up the src folder and go inside of the app folder. And the first thing that I'm going to open here is the layout.tsx. This is the root layout. This is typical to what you will see in a Next.js application. And we have here a pretty common pattern, which is a provider's component, which we ourselves created. So let's open it up and let's look at what it has. So here at the top, we have use client, which makes this a client component, which is pretty typical for any sort of providers over here. And then we have this query client that we are getting from this custom get query client function. Everything else is pretty typical. We're then passing the query client to the query client provider from React Query, which makes essentially the query client and React Query accessible to our entire application. All of the magic happens inside of this get query client function. So if we open this up, let's look at what we have here. So here we have this make query client function at the top. Its only job is to return to us a new instance of the query client, which is exactly what you do whenever you want to set up React Query. The only difference here is that we have some default options set up for every single query, and we're setting a stale time that is different than the default stale time. Don't worry about this too much. There is a reason why we're doing this, but I will come back to this a little bit later in the video. Then over here, we have this get query client function, which checks if we are on the server via this isServer boolean, which comes from React Query directly. And if we are on the server, we are going to return every single time a new instance of the query client by calling the make query client function. So on the server, we always return a new instance of the query client. This is important. However, if we're not on the server, if we're on the browser, then what we have here is we have this variable that is outside of any React component, any scope of React, where we define this a query client or undefined, and then we make a check. If we have something in this variable, then we actually just return the variable. Otherwise, we will instantiate a query client. This is a way for us to store the query client outside of a React component, and there is a specific reason for this. The reason why we do it this way is actually specific to Next.js and React and is a little bit more of an advanced concept, but the fact that we have it here in this providers over here, we have query client, right, where we're actually getting a query client. What happens in Next.js specifically is this providers component here actually goes inside of this root layout, which behind the scenes, you don't actually see this, is actually wrapping this component inside of a suspense boundary, right? So you don't see it, but it's as if we had a suspense boundary over here that is going to wrap our providers. And what happens with suspense is that when there's anything that is loading in here, this component is actually going to get suspended, which means unmounted, right? And then we're going to lose that instance of the query client, right? Because of how suspense works. And so when the component gets remounted once again, we are going to have a new instance of the query client if we had done this in a different way without storing it in this variable here. So the reason we put it in a variable here is that we can actually store it outside of React, outside of the render cycle of React and even Next.js, and still keep the reference to the query client if we already had one and we lost it because of a suspense boundary. right? If we were using something else and we did not have this suspense boundary, right? If it was actually below the provider's component, we would not have this problem. We could use something like state or whatever to just get this query client. But because we are working in Next.js and the specific way that the layout works in Next.js, we have to put this in a variable outside of the React scope. And with that, that's kind of it in terms of the setup. So now we have this get query client function, which is going to work both on the server and on the client. So now let's look at how we can actually use this query client and what we should even use it for. So I'm going to open up here and I'm going to go inside of the posts folder and find the page.tsx. This is going to be the posts page. So this is a server component, right? All components are server components by default unless made otherwise using the useClient boundary in Next.js. And as you can see here, we are using the query client, the get query client function, and we're accessing the query client here in a server component. And then what we're doing is we're calling await query client dot prefetch query, and then we're passing it here a query key of posts and then a query function of get posts. This is a function that is just going to mock return some data from a mock API, so don't worry too much about it. And then that's it. We're not getting any results from this function over here, and we're not passing any props to any other components. Instead, what we're doing is we have this hydration boundary component, which receives a state prop, and we're passing dehydrate query client to it as the state prop. What is this and what is going on? Well, before we get to that, let's just look at this post component and let's see how we're actually making use of React Query on the client. Because as you can see, this is a client component. We're using use client here at the top, and you have now something that looks a little bit more familiar. We have the use query hook where we're passing the same query key to posts and then the same query function to get the posts. Then we're accessing the data here, and then we're just going to render the data in our actual components. So this is the complete end-to-end flow of React Query going from the server to the client. So now let's actually try to understand what is going on and how all the different pieces fit together in this puzzle. So first of all, if we look at just this component here, this posts client component, well, from the perspective of this component, this has virtually no differences to any other component. We don't even know that there's a server if you just looked at this component, right? I could now onboard a new developer that has never seen server components in their life before, and I could tell them to make some changes here, and they would be completely familiar and know what to do because there is no difference between all the code that we have here and code that you would typically write in a client-only React application. And that's exactly the way that it should be, because React Query is a client state management library, right? It functions on the client. These are hooks. You use hooks from React Query to do all of the magic of fetching data, getting your pending states and your error states and all of that, the caching and all of that. This is all client-side functionality. So React Query, for the most part, has no business being on the server side. But then if we go back to the server side, well, we did put React Query over here and we did use the query client. So why did we do it and what's the point of doing it? The point of React Query on the server is that this component posts page runs on the server, which means that we can fetch data on the server. We can have an asynchronous component and we can run asynchronous functions on the server, which generally we prefer to do than fetching data on the client, because fetching data on the client expects you to have sent the JavaScript bundle to the user then downloaded that bundle, the React application spin up, all your components mounted, this post component mounted, and only then can you start fetching the data. This is slow. And if you have server components, you want to make use of server components and the fact that you can directly fetch the data on the server as you're requesting the rest of React, the rest of the JavaScript and HTML, and you can save a little bit of time and provide a better user experience for your users. And so when it comes to server components, if you want to use React Query, the only thing that you can do and the only thing that you should do is pre-fetch the data that you're then going to use in your client components, which, as you can see, is exactly what we're doing. We're getting the query client here from our function that again handles both the server and the client. And then we are calling prefetch query from the query client, and we're passing the same query key, the same function as we use inside of this client component. And what this means is that by the time that this client component actually mounts, right after the JavaScript bundle and everything else before it happened, the data for the post is already going to be in the cache made available to this component, and you can directly show it to the UI without waiting for another fetch to happen, because the fetch has been prefetched in the server component and then passed to the query client and made available to this client component. And all of that happens through this component here, this hydration boundary component. So this component, as you can see here, receives one prop, the state, and here we're passing a dehydrated version of the query client. What this essentially means is that we're going to take all of the data that we have in the query client, which at this point is only going to contain this data here for the post because we haven't prefetched anything else. And then we're going to pass that, we're going to dehydrate it, which essentially we're going to make it accessible to the client. And then that component, this hydration boundary, handles everything for us behind the scenes so that we can just directly use this over here. And because React Query on the client also has access to the query client over here by this provider, we are automatically going to have the data from this prefetch available directly on the client. And this is why on the server, if I go back here to this function, this is why on the server, you always want to make a new query client every single time they use it, because here you are dehydrating the state of the entire query client. If you had shared a query client between different requests or even between different users, you would actually be passing too much data, even sometimes duplicated data, to your client component, which is inefficient. It's fair that in this component, you would still only access the post data, but you would have in the query client unnecessary data that you don't actually need. So for that reason, you always want on the server to create a new query client so that it's always fresh and only contains the data that you actually need. And that's also why, if I can go back here to the stale time over here, what we're doing here is we're putting a stale time, which essentially is going to make React Query not refetch the data immediately, because oftentimes that's what you want, right? We just prefetched this data in a server component, and now in the client component we have this data here. We don't want React Query to start refetching this immediately because it just has been prefetched, right? So that's why we're putting a stale time here to actually prevent the default behavior of React Query. This is only relevant when we actually have a server environment that we now have to think about and we now can use to actually benefit our use of React Query. And really, to make things very simple, this is all that it is. The server over here, so this entire component and Next.js that really allows us to have server components, is just now an extra environment that we can use to actually better the user experience and the speed at which we get our data. Once again, this client component here doesn't care about the fact that there's a server component that is rendering it, that is actually prefetching the data. We could completely kill the server component and just render the post component here without it, and this would work just fine. It would just not have the data, so it would have to fetch the data. But now that we have this server environment here, we can use it for our own benefit, for the speed, and actually prefetch the data in server components. And that's generally the only way that you want to use server components with React Query. Remember, React Query is a client-specific fetching library. It's an asynchronous state management library, but it's built for the client, and there's no real other use case that you kind of want to use React Query for on the server, right? It's meant for the client, and there are just some limited functionalities that you should use on the server. Something that you shouldn't do, for example, is instead of prefetch, you can call fetch query, which is here a function from React Query, and then you can actually get access to the data. So I think post like this, you can get access to the data, and then what you can do is you can do post and then 0, and then I don't know, do something like ID. Right? You could do this, and then you would still have this component over here that fetches data in the exact same way. Now you don't want to do this, and here's why. If you do it this way, now you put some data in a server component which does not re-render. There's no concept of re-rendering on a server component, but then you're also using that same data on the client. So what happens if on the client, you now change a post somewhere else in the application, you invalidate the cache of this query over here, and then you get different posts. This post over here is now going to have a different ID, or maybe you even add a post or whatever. Now you're going to have data that is out of sync. You're going to have a UI that is out of sync because the server over here does not re-render like a client component does. So for that reason, you should not fetch the query inside of a server component. And the only thing that you want to do is just prefetch the data, and that's it. So now with this, you might be asking yourself, well, is it really worth it for us to use React Query in the first place? Because what we could actually do here is we can just get rid of React Query completely. We can get rid of this client component, so not even make this a client component, and have this just received here some posts as props, right? And we can just ignore the type. And here, instead of that, we can just post like here, right? And then what we can do is we can even get rid of this prefetch over here, right? And we can just pass the posts here, and we can do const posts await gets posts, right? And then pass the post over here, right? We could completely bypass React Query and not even use it and not bother with React Query in the first place. So why would you even use React Query when you're working with server components? Well, the truth is you don't really have to. And oftentimes you're actually better off doing it this way rather than using React Query. because this way is actually better. Everything happens on the server now, right? We can actually get rid of this hydration boundary, which we no longer need, right? And then now everything happens on the server. We're fetching our data over here, right, directly from the function that fetches the post, right? We're getting the post, we're passing them to another server component, and this component just renders out all of the posts. There's no re-rendering, there's no client bundle, there's no JavaScript, everything gets converted to HTML and sent directly to the user. So why React Query? The only times where it makes sense to actually do React Query is when you want to have some functionality that is client focused, right? So if I can go here, if we can just undo all of these things, right? You wouldn't do it if you're just using plain React Query. Use query. You would do it if you're doing something like infinite query over here, right? Infinite query is another hook from React Query that gives you access to have a sort of infinite scroll and programmatically load more data as the user scrolls. This is a client-specific functionality, and you cannot do this on the server. So if you want, you can actually use React Query for this. It is a good use case, and then you have a justified use case of using React Query, and then you would do this whole server and client kind of combination to make it work, right? Because then you would go here on the server, and then instead of prefetch query, I believe you can do prefetch infinite query like this, and I believe we can import, prefetch infinite query, and then we can just import it directly, right, and ignore the type errors. The props are obviously wrong, but we can then prefetch the current page that we're on. We can even come here and use the search parameter. So if we have in the URL page 5, we can directly get it from here, from this server component, pass it over here to the prefetch infinite query, and then directly have access to them over here as well, right? That is a good use case for using React Query, and that's when you would start to combine them both on the server and on the client. So ultimately, really it depends, right? Think of your use case and really think about whether or not you actually want and need to use React Query in your application, because it's totally fine to ditch it, to not use it, and to just use server components and just fetch data on the server and call it a day. This is what I'm doing for a lot of my applications, and I'm only keeping React Query when I really need some client-specific functionality. So that's it. That's what I have for this video. I really hope that you've enjoyed this video. And if you did, you can also click here to subscribe, or you can click here to watch a different video of mine that YouTube seems to think that you're really going to enjoy. And with that being said, my name has been Darius Kozin. This is Kozin Solutions. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Ciao, ciao.